My name is Jeff Nichols from Westminster College, and I'm very pleased to be chairing this session of three quite different papers, all about loss and death on the Great Salt Lake. Our order is going to be a little different than what is posted in the program. The first to present will be Ian Christensen, who's an independent historian, and the title of his paper is The Lost History of Saltair, Utah's Coney Island. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, correct. Okay. As the train rolls out of the station, it sways side to side, with its open-air cars filled to beyond capacity with riders, some having barely a toe and a finger holding them to the train. Once outside the city, the train picks up speed to quickly cross the desolate valley floor. The combined smells of smoke and dust are common to passengers that have traveled this way before. As the train gets closer to its destination, its speed slows as the ground meets the water. However, the beach is not the destination, as now the train continues onto a pier extending away from the beach. Soon the smells of smoke and dust are replaced by the smell of salt water and popcorn as the train arrives at its destination. As it slows, the sounds of the huffing and puffing of the train are replaced with the splashing of swimmers, the distant roar of the roller coaster, and the thunderous steps of thousands dancing. As the train stops, the passengers depart and immediately witness the sight they have traveled far and wide to behold. Now standing before them, casting a shadow as the sun sets behind it, is the massive pavilion building, rising 100 feet above the water. Whispers and gasps are heard from the group, such as magnificent, grand, and beautiful. The place, Saltair, the Coney Island of the West. Good morning, my name is Ian Christensen, and I'm an independent researcher writing a book called The Lost History of Saltair, Utah's Coney Island. And what I just read is the first opening paragraph to the book describing the resort. The Lost History of Saltair is a non-fiction history book about the Saltair Beach Resort. The Saltair Beach Resort was a bathing resort, and bathing being the term for swimming in the 1800s. They weren't taking baths, they were swimming in the Great Salt Lake. It operated from June of 1893 to September of 1958. I've been working on my book for 5 years and hope to have it out by next year. I'm shooting for next year because next year is the 130th anniversary of the resort opening, but it is also the 65th anniversary of the closing of the resort. Both anniversaries are happening on the same year next year. And so today I'm pleased to be here. I am nervous, so sorry if I'm shaky. So I've been working on a new logo for my book, and I wanted to present it today. And so today, this group is the first group to see it. And this is the new logo for my book. Been working with a local artist on it for the last couple of months. And so today, my presentation will be a little bit of a preview about my book. And I hope that you'll learn something today that you didn't know before. So first, I'm going to start off by asking 3 questions. I just kind of want to, if you answer, they're yes and no questions. If you answer yes, please raise your hand. If the answer is no, just don't raise your hand. So I just want to kind of get a gauge of how much knowledge people have about Saltair. So the first question is, who has heard of Saltair? Second one is, when you hear the name, do you think of the concert venue that's out on the lake right now? And the third one is, do you think that building that's out there was built in 1893? Okay, I'm kind of surprised by that. I get that answer a lot, that I think it was the one built in 1893. So Saltair's history has been shredded over the years. mainly because the building has been gone for so long. And a lot of the history has never been written down properly and has been just told over and over again, much like the Whisper game that we played as kids, and where each time it gets told and told and retold, the story changes, and now the history of Saltair has been mixed with more opinions than facts. And so one of my aims in my book is to correct that history and tell the history exactly how it was. And so a little bit about myself. How I got into writing about Saltair is actually my love of roller coasters. I'm a big time roller coaster amusement park enthusiast. I've been on 89 different roller coasters around the world. And as my wife can attest, anytime we travel anywhere, I always try to find at least one to ride. And so my love of roller coasters goes more beyond just riding them. I love to design them, and I have special roller coaster software that I use. And an example of this is up here on the screen. And 5 years ago, I was looking to, aside from custom designing roller coasters, I like to recreate ones in my program that actually existed. And so I came upon Saltair's Giant Racer, which was their last roller coaster. And up above is the real picture, and then this is in my software that I've designed. I spent about a year working on that design. And all more pictures of it will be in my book and blueprints and things like that. And so as I started researching to design this roller coaster, I started collecting more and more data and kind of caught the history bug, and wanted to know more about the other roller coasters of Saltair. And I started just accumulating more data. And when it came down to it, I had so much data that originally I had planned on just making a YouTube video, but this YouTube was not going to be the proper way to share this information. So I started wanting to write a book on just the roller coasters of Saltair. And as I talked about it with the people, it is a real focused idea. And so I got the suggestion that I should expand to the whole resort. And this made sense because as I tried to write just about the roller coasters, I would have to include sections about the resort, but I would have to cut those sections short. And so it's going to work out better in the end to write about the whole resort. And so that's kind of how I've come to write about Saltair. So on a side note, through my research, I've actually found out that in my family, I have Utah roller coaster history. I have a first cousin 3 times removed who was the manager of Lagoon Amusement Park in 1920. And he was the one who made the decision to build the wood roller coaster that Lagoon has today that you can still ride. So that was kind of cool to find out in my research. So when anyone talks about bathing in the Great Salt Lake, Saltair gets all of the glory, and rightfully so. It was the largest and the most successful of the Great Salt Lake bathing resorts. What doesn't get mentioned is the 8 resorts that came before it. And I think it's imperative, and in order to understand Saltair properly, is that you have to be able to have at least a little bit working knowledge of the resorts that came before it. And so in my book, the first 8 chapters, one chapter each is dedicated to each of these resorts to give a base knowledge to the reader of why Saltair was built the way it was, because it was built the way it was because of failures of the other resorts. And so I'll go over these real quick. Nothing in depth today, but they started in 1870, and there was 9 resorts in total, including Saltair. The first resort was called the Lakeside Resort, and it was west of present-day Kaysville, Utah. It started in 1870. It was started by the Utah Central Railroad as a way to promote passenger travel. The Utah Central Railroad was the first railroad between Ogden and Salt Lake City, and it did freight and passenger and everything. And so building the resort was a way to get people to actually take it. So the next resort was the Lake Point Resort in 1871. It was started by a man named Dr. Jeter Clinton. He owned a ranch out there, and eventually there was a company that wanted to ship coal across the Great Salt Lake using a steamship, and it was called the City of Corinne because it was built in the City of Corinne, which was on the transcontinental route. And shortly after 6 months of doing that, they found out that transporting coal over the lake by boat was not efficient at all. And they ended up turning it into a cruise ship. and it was much more profitable as a cruise ship, and it ended up making the Lake Point Resort its home base. They would go and give 8-hour cruises across the Salt Lake on the steamship. And the Lake Point Resort is so named because of the southern point of the Salt Lake. The third resort to open was the Black Rock Resort in 1876. Although it was first used by the Mormon pioneers on July 28, 1847 as their first trip to the Great Salt Lake to bathe and discover it. It was also, before the resort was started at Black Rock, it was the location of the first recording device for recording the lake levels put there in 1874. The Lakeshore Resort, it is west of present-day Centerville, Utah. It was the first established marina on the Great Salt Lake, and bathing was more of a side attraction to this resort. This was more of a sailing resort. These were guys from New York that came and so I'll go through these. I just got told I got little time left, so you'll have to read my book to see the other ones. I want to get to Saltair. So, sorry, I figured I would prepare more than I had, so. Okay, so Saltair was built in 1893. And sorry, I gotta move my papers. Okay. So it was built on a pier 1 mile from the Great Salt Lake. And the reason this was done is because the other resorts had been built on the beach. And then the Great Salt Lake, as we can see today, is shrinking. It's done that over its lifetime, gone in and out, in and out. And so when the lake would leave these resorts, it would leave them high and dry, and nobody wanted to visit a resort to go swimming that they had to walk 2 miles to get to the water from. So Saltair's plan was to build it a mile out into the lake to hopefully account for that. So these are some pictures of the resort. So this is Saltair 1. This is from 1893 to 1925. So this one right here, this is concept art drawn by the architect Richard K.A. Kledding. The arms never went out this far. This was just his concept. This is from opening year, as long with this one as well. The resort had 2,500 lights. It lit up just like Vegas at night. This one is a picture from pre-1915. The reason we know this is because the floor is wooden. In 1915, they turned the whole pier into a cement floor, which would actually benefit the resort later on in just a little bit. The resort did everything first class. They, even for the end of their first season, they brought out the Barnum Circus to celebrate the end of their first season, and they performed on the pier. It also played an important part in Utah's statehood. Utah's statehood, a lot of the meetings were held at Saltair, and when statehood was granted, the celebrations were out at Saltair. It had the largest unobstructed dance floor in the world, one that the resort claimed could hold 10,000 couples at once dancing. So they had their best season in 1924. And then 1924, the resort brought in 500,000 people to the state of Utah in 3 months, between the end of May to the start of September. And the cool thing about that is that's pretty crazy for 1924 to have 500,000 people gather somewhere at such a time. But in Utah at the time, there was only 400,000 people as a state population. So Saltair brought in more than the whole that lived in the whole state in 1924. And it seemed like the party would never end. And some of the attractions they had were SkeeBall. They had roller coasters, obviously. But the cool thing about SkeeBall is Saltair was the 11th place ever to have a SkeeBall attraction worldwide. SkeeBall was invented in 1908 and Saltair installed theirs in 1911. So it seemed like the party would never end. They were bringing in people and everything. And in 1925, the whole resort burned down. Everything in red that you can see on here was lost in the fire. So the only thing that was left was bathing houses, and there was a roller coaster here that's not on this map because it was before that. But everything in red was lost. The resort eventually did rebuild with new owners. So this one is Saltair 1, and this is Saltair 2. You can see that they have similarities. They have a Moorish type architecture. Saltair 2 was meant to be easier to maintain on the Salt Lake and more usable. It was bigger in every way, just a little bit every which way. So these are pictures of Saltair 2. Sorry, we're okay. So just quickly, the purpose of my book is to help pass on the legacy of Saltair. These are pictures from when it closed. These are from Saltair 3 before it was flooded. And then this is an idea they had after it had shut down, that they were going to turn it into more of an amusement park around it and build roads on the lake bed and everything. But yeah, sorry I'm getting cut short, but if you want to, I have an Instagram page and Facebook page called The Lost History of Saltair, where I post regular updates on my book. And you can also email me at losthistoryofsaltair@outlook.com. Thank you for your time today. Thank you.
Well, thanks to Ian. And now again, we're going a little out of order here. Well, not with Fiona. Our next presenter will be Fiona Summers from the University of Utah in their graduate environmental humanities program. And her paper is called The Implications of Redlining in a Dying Great Salt Lake on the Wasatch Communities.
Sorry, I don't have that presentation. Okay. Okay, hello everybody. I'm Fiona Summers, a student at the University of Utah. I was transplanted here in Salt Lake City about a year ago. Before then, I spent my time in Michigan at Kalamazoo College studying biology. Therefore, much of my work looks at the intersects of science, culture, and history. And today I will be talking about redlining, the Great Salt Lake, and air pollution. Okay. Today, the demographics in many large cities reflect the redlining maps created in the 1930s. Not only has it perpetuated in modern segregation, but it has also resulted in environmental injustice towards minority groups. Researchers have associated higher exposure to pollution in areas that were originally deemed hazardous and definitely declining areas. In Salt Lake City, residents who live in redlined areas are exposed to higher pollution sources at a higher concentration when compared to their white counterparts on the east side. As the Great Salt Lake continues to dry up, it poses a significant health risk for the surrounding community. This study analyzes the wind direction from 6 weather stations situated between the Great Salt Lake and Salt Lake City to determine which direction the dust plumes will carry potential toxic dust. This study finds the southwest direction of the wind will primarily impact the west side, thus further compounding the already existing air inequality issue in Salt Lake City. Environmental racism was coined by Robert Bullard in the late 19th century. He defines it as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, whether intended or unattended individuals, groups, or communities based on race or color. In the United States, many researchers have uncovered a correlation between environmental racism and redlining. During the 1930s 30s, the housing market was in crisis due to the Great Depression. In order to fix this, the government created a group called the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, to limit foreclosures. Once the market stabilized, the government hired HOLC employees to evaluate real estate risk levels in over 200 cities. Salt Lake was one of them. They determined areas on a scale of A to D, representing best, A, to hazardous, D. What determined the grade was based on structural quality, neighborhood amenities, and largely demographics. These grades then influenced agencies to determine where a safe area would be to give out a mortgage loan. This was the beginning of systemic environmental racism within urban planning. Using the maps, which later became known as redlining maps, encourage mortgage lenders to favor affluent whites and deny minority groups. Basically, redlining made it difficult for residences to obtain mortgage assistance and thus become homeowners, and often denied minorities access to mortgage assistance. Today, the demographics in many large cities reflect the redlining maps created in 1930s. Not only has it perpetuated in modern segregation, but it has also resulted in environmental injustice towards minority groups. Researchers have associated higher exposure to pollution in areas that were originally deemed hazardous and definitely declining areas. Therefore, I became interested in the possibility that a Great Salt Lake dry lake bed could contribute to the already existing air inequality issue in Salt Lake City. My research question began as the Great Salt Lake continues to dry up and release toxic heavy metals to the atmosphere, will the dust plumes compound the already existing air inequality issue in Salt Lake City? In order to create a just society, we need to understand the depths of environmental racism. Robert Ballard says, environmental justice embraces the principle that all people and communities are entitled to equal protection of environment, health, employment, housing, transportation, and civil rights laws. In this first figure, I am situating where Salt Lake City is in comparison to where the Great Salt Lake is. As you can see, the Salt Lake City is just southeast of the Great Salt Lake. In figure 2, I am looking at the historic HOLC maps on top of what is now Salt Lake City today. And as you can see, the red lines indicate where it was deemed hazardous, where the yellow lines represent where they deemed it definitely declining. In figure 3, I am looking at the population demographics in Salt Lake City, and more specifically where they are in terms of where the HOLC maps are. So this displays the population of residents who do not identify as white. Many of the areas that were deemed hazardous in red now house the largest population of non-white residents. The population of residents in the D grades of Salt Lake City range from 29 to 61% non-white. However, in areas that were determined best, blue, or still desirable in green, currently house more white residents within the demographics ranging from 8 to 28% non-white. So it is clear through this figure that we can see most of our minority groups are in the sections that were deemed hazardous or declining. Furthermore, I wanted to look more specifically into our Latino and Hispanic community members, and it reflects the same pattern. There's a large concentration of Hispanic and Latinx communities in grades D through C than there are in sections A through B. In hazardous or redlined areas, the Hispanic and Latinx population demographics range from 26 to 54%. These communities are most populated in the furthest west side, making up 41 to 54% of the population demographics in this area. However, they are least represented in A or desirable sections, only making up 3 to 5.5% of the demographic population. Like any city, there's pollution throughout the landscape. In Salt Lake City, many of the pollution hotspots are concentrated in areas that were historically deemed hazardous, or the redlined areas. Not only are the more pollution hotspots in these redlined areas concentrated on the west side of Salt Lake City than the east side, it is clear that they have higher concentrations of pollution. Furthermore, these areas house the highest population of non-white and Latinx community members. Therefore, these residents are exposed to a higher concentration of pollution when compared to their white counterparts. To understand the implications of the dust plumes from the Great Salt Lake and the area it is likely to cover, it is important to look at wind direction. This figure represents the wind direction from 6 weather stations in Salt Lake City, situated in between the city and the Great Salt Lake. Each weather station displays the 2 strongest wind directions collected, generally a northwest and a southeast projection. The 6 weather stations included in the study largely show a wind direction heading in the southeast direction towards the west side. Therefore, dust storms from the Great Salt Lake will most likely follow in the same direction. I chose these 6 weather stations due to their proximity to the Great Salt Lake and Salt Lake City. When the historic HOLC maps are overlaid by the weather stations and their respective wind direction, it can display the possible dust distribution within Salt Lake City communities. There are 2 weather stations displayed within the HOLC boundaries. Of those 2, one is situated on the west side, whereas the other is situated on the east side. The weather station on the west side shows a wind direction of southeast and northwest. Since I am interested in dust plumes from the Great Salt Lake, I am interested in the southwest direction of wind. Therefore, one could draw conclusions that the dust from the Great Salt Lake will generally flow a southwest direction and primarily expose the west side to a higher concentration of dust. The weather station on the east side shows a wind direction of south, almost completely avoiding the east side, which houses predominantly affluent whites. This is probably due to the topography of the valley, and the wind is most likely heading south at that point due to the foothills and the Wasatch Range to the east. Overall, one could conclude the general direction of the weather station is southeast, and dust plumes will most likely follow the same direction, thus affecting the Latinx community more than their white counterparts on the east side. It is important to note that redlining continues to segregate our cities. In some neighborhoods of the west side, over 50% of the residents identify as non-white. And it is clear through research at Utah State University that the west side is already exposed to more pollution. And the current demographics reflect the historic HOLC maps. Areas that were deemed hazardous or definitely declining now house the highest population of non-whites in Salt Lake City. Not only is it important to look at how historic systems can influence modern day populations, but it is important to look at how these areas can pose potential environmental hazards for the communities. The West Side and who house our Hispanic and Latinx community members are exposed to more pollution sites and at a higher concentration than other parts of the city. Research has already documented this injustice, but I am focused on how the Great Salt Lake will compound the already existing pollution air inequality in Salt Lake. As the Great Salt Lake continues to dry up, the dry lake bed poses a serious health hazard for the surrounding community. In order to understand the direction of this dust pollution source, the wind direction of 6 weather stations situated between the Great Salt Lake and Salt Lake City show that this air inequality will continue to become exacerbated. Generally, the weather stations followed a southwest direction. However, the one weather station on the east side shows the wind going south, avoiding the east side of Salt Lake City. With this data, one can conclude that the west side will predominantly be affected by the dust plumes from the Great Salt Lake. It is true that the pollution will largely impact the whole Wasatch Front during large dust storms. However, what will happen on relatively mild, windy days? Who will be most impacted on non-severe windy days? Historically, we have ignored research that looks into environmental racism, and this has resulted in, sorry, I lost my note. And this has resulted in decades-long exposure of pollution to minority community members. We need to shift our focus, our funding, and our research questions and prioritize solutions that support the health of all community members. This study suggests we need to focus on the impact of toxic dust, specifically on the west side. Not only is this information important to know for the community members that reside there, but it is also important so that we can present this information to policymakers who can drive decisions to protect the Great Salt Lake from further drying up. The Great Salt Lake is largely drying up due to water diversion practices for the growing human population in northern Utah. Therefore, water diversion practices need to be reevaluated to allow rivers, such as the Bear River, to flow back into the Great Salt Lake. Communication between the locals and government officials is imperative in order to make a just decision for all that protects the ecosystem and human health. Thank you for coming today, and I appreciate you listening to this talk.
Thanks very much to Fiona Summers. And our third paper is by Madison Melton, also from the University of Utah Graduate Environmental Humanities Program. And they'll talk about, quote, the once great inland seas, Blue Humanities in the environmental mirror of Lake Teshkoko and the Great Salt Lake. Except you told me you changed the name. So
yes.
What's the new name?
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff. Yes, I have shifted the name a little bit since I submitted that title. And I'm now calling this The Dissolution of Cities and Salt, the Legacy of Lake Teshkoko and the Ongoing Disappearance of the Great Salt Lake. Yeah. Yes, that's it. All right, thank you so much. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. Yes, my name is Madison, or Maddie Melton, and I'm a graduate student in the environmental humanities at the University of Utah alongside Fiona Summers. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm actually going to start by talking about a different lake. As we can see in this image here, Lake Teshkoko. And this image presented here is in the Valley of Mexico, which is the current site of Mexico City. But prior to being Mexico City, this city here was Tenochtitlan, which was one of the largest cities in the Aztec Empire, also known as the Mexica, people who lived in this city for 2 centuries. This image is from the 1950s. It was painted based on several maps and images that remain from the pre-colonial period in a series of codices. There's not too much that remains from that period, unfortunately, due to the impacts of colonization, but this is a more recent image created based on what this city might have looked like in the heyday of the Mexica settlement in this area. And as you can see, the city is actually sitting on an island in the middle of a lake. And this is not just a lake, but a saline lake, similar to the Great Salt Lake. That covered this entire valley region, and as you can see, had several causeways and stuff going out of it, which I'll get into a little bit more later. Okay, And then, of course, the second lake I'm going to be talking about today is the Great Salt Lake. This is actually a photo that I took recently on a flight. But what I liked about it so much is that you can see very clearly the railway causeways passing through the lake, and then the significant difference in color on either side of the lake as a result. All right. And what I'm going to be talking about specifically in relation to these two different lakes, 2,000 miles apart, is the Blue Humanities. So the Blue Humanities is a term coined by Steve Mentz, who argues that a blue cultural studies must consider the physical environment as a substantial partner in the creation of cultural meaning. While ideologies of land ownership, especially around enclosure, have long been a part of the discourse of early modern literary criticism, too little attention has been paid to the ways in which prolonged exposure to the deep sea challenged early modern legal, scientific, and literary habits of thought. So the Blue Humanities has traditionally looked specifically at ocean environments, and there's very specific reasons for that. Mainly that it's looking at the way that oceans have been a part of particularly Western cultural legacy for many centuries, but in the wake of a sort of modern environmental movement have sort of disappeared into more green ways of thinking about the environment, focusing particularly on land-based communities, land-based solutions to environmental problems, and arguing for a return to a focus on the ocean as a really significant part of human culture and human history, not just in island nations, but communities throughout the world as well. So there's great justification for why oceans are at the heart of Blue Humanities, and this does not usually include things like rivers and lakes, because those are kind of part of the sort of green thinking around land masses. However, I would argue that saline lakes occupy a slightly different position, in part because kind of culturally people don't know exactly what to do with them, and they present a sort of conundrum that I think that has led in many cases to their disappearance or ongoing disappearance. And so I'm going to look at these two examples today in comparison. All right, so I have another couple images here. So on the left, we see this is another image from one of the codices of Tenochtitlan. And this is kind of an image of the founding of the city, which happened in 1323. And so the Mexica settled this area, and the area was chosen in kind of cultural memory because of a bird that landed on this prickly pear cactus in the area, which was seen as a sign that this was the place to begin a community. There were also a lot of, I'll show a map in just a moment, but there were a lot of springs that were considered kind of sweet water in this area as well, which might have provided some kind of practical motivation for choosing this site. And then of course on the right, we have the famous declaration here in Salt Lake City of this being the place on the southeast side of the Great Salt Lake as well. Interestingly, because I think especially in relation to some of the things we've just heard, the Great Salt Lake was considered a very healthful environment because of its salinity. The Great Salt Lake didn't breed bugs and disease in quite the same way that other regions that the pioneers had lived in did. And so it was considered this like very healthful region, and therefore a desirable place to settle despite the water. All right, so here we have this image, and this is kind of a map, an approximation of what Lake Teshkoko might have looked like in the early settlement years of the Mexica in this area. And so this is actually, it's one lake, but also 5 lakes. So during dry periods of the year, this lake would often turn into 5 separate lakes, and then during the wet season, it would fill up. So those lakes would then be connected into one large lake. But you can see in the southern half, there are these 2 smaller lakes at the bottom of that image there, and those lakes were actually freshwater. And so actually very similar to Utah Lake and the Great Salt Lake, these were at a slightly higher elevation, which meant that the freshwater would flow down into the saline lakes to the north. And then to the left, you can see in that island to the left of the image is where Tenochtitlan was situated. And then to its west, there was the kind of Sweetwater Springs that was considered the kind of ideal freshwater source for the city. And so you can also see in this image that under the Mexica during this time period, there was a tremendous amount of very intentional and thoughtful infrastructure around this body of water. Living by a saline lake obviously presents tremendous challenges to agriculture and making sure that you have appropriate drinking water. And so there was this massive causeway, you can see it to the east of the site of Tenochtitlan here, that divided the lake and separated the freshwater sections from the saltwater. It did flood frequently, so there were still plenty of challenges, but this causeway and then some other infrastructure as well in this area separated the freshwater from the saltwater, and then created really intricate systems of agriculture and canals through the area that were kind of apart from the salinity of the northern part of the lake. So here, this is moving forward in time quite a bit. So the valley was settled in the 1320s by the Mexica and existed for 2 centuries with this kind of growing complexity of water infrastructure in the area. 2 centuries later, the Spanish arrived and, as I think we all know what happened next, decimated the communities and the local populations and a lot of this water infrastructure with them. Actually, when they arrived in Tenochtitlan initially, they were initially defeated because they tried to canoe into the city, but the Mexica obviously had a much more intricate knowledge of how these water systems worked and were able to use that to their advantage to initially defeat the Spanish. The Spanish came back with a new plan, destroying that giant causeway that we saw in the last image, which then allowed the saline water to flow into the freshwater sources. And that was their tactical advantage to destroy the city. But they were, in a sense, shooting themselves in the foot here as well, because after taking over the city, they did not prioritize rebuilding this causeway and redeveloping some of these intricate systems that had allowed such settlement in this area. This was one of the largest cities in the Aztec Empire. And they were not doing what they needed to do to rebuild the infrastructure to remain in this region. So immediately water problems started to emerge. There were significant issues with flooding. There were challenges with agriculture because of the salinity of the soil. And for centuries after colonization, Mexico City has battled these challenges of living kind of within or beside a saline lake. So this image here jumps us ahead to 1856, or yeah, 1856. And this, as you can already see, you can see Mexico City in the same place as Tenochtitlan was in the previous image, but it's expanded pretty significantly. And the lake in its wake has shrunk. So there were several projects throughout those centuries to drain water from the lake into the surrounding valleys and deserts to try to prevent some of the flooding, which was only getting worse because of deforestation, which led to silt buildup, which then led to greater significance of those floods. And this continued through the 19th and into the 20th centuries. The consequence of which is that by the 1970s, about half of the initial lake bed was already settled. And today, a very, very small portion of the lake remains. So jumping ahead here. So after draining the lake to prevent some of these floods, in 2022, actually, so this year in March, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, the current president of Mexico, declared this one section of the original Lake Texcoco as a protected site, in kind of memoriam to this lake that is no longer there. I looked up the size of this protected site and it's 0.05 square miles. So just a fraction of this lake that once covered the entire valley in this region, which is now one of the largest cities in the world, of course, at about 20 million residents currently. So this brings us to the Great Salt Lake again. And the reason I wanted to speak last is because I think my colleagues have done a really great job introducing the past and the kind of cultural legacy of Saltair specifically, but the Great Salt Lake more broadly to the city of Salt Lake, as well as the sort of future implications of some of this devastation that's happening right now. So in Mexico City, when this was occurring throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, one of the consequences was very similar to what we can expect to see in Salt Lake City, which was tremendous dust storms, picking up in particular in the 1920s. So one resident, oh, that's okay. So one resident is reported as saying in this time that it was difficult to make out the silhouette of a person from 3 or 4 meters away. In the wake of this, one Mexico City citizen said that the draining of the lake has brought not one benefit to Mexico City, but indeed many evils. So you had tremendous problems with air pollution, as we expect to see in Salt Lake City. And in addition to that, there was the added issue. Mexico City was then relying on underground aquifers for a source of water, which then led to the sinking of the city, particularly because that lakebed soil was prone to compression. So it caused tremendous environmental impact, which is only starting to be addressed today, particularly with the recent protected area in memoriam to this lake. But it's caused tremendous difficulties and similar things to what we can expect to experience here. But what I find powerful about these two stories in comparison, this one that kind of happened over the course of centuries many years ago, and then one that's kind of happening today in relation to the Blue Humanities, is that I think much of the current research and focus on the disappearance of the Great Salt Lake is focused on these environmental impacts, which is important and true. But also I think there's a significance in the cultural legacy of these cities, not just as cities unto themselves, but in relation to these saline lakes that they existed beside. And the Blue Humanities, I think, can be then a lens through which we can start to understand how these cultural legacies disappeared. Saline lakes are not productive in the way that we traditionally think of the land and the way that we interact with the land. We think of rivers, for the power they can give in terms of hydropower, and also, of course, freshwater sources and all of these things. But saline lakes, okay, we have the brine shrimp industry, and there's of course some things that the lake contributes economically to Salt Lake City in a direct sense. But more broadly, I think people are a little bit confused by the salinity of these lakes and trying to figure out like where they fit into our cultural legacy. And as a result, it can be then easy to sort of let them disappear when they become inconvenient, or their needs become, the perceived need is stronger in the area of, for example, like diverting freshwater sources from those lakes for agriculture and drinking water. So I think the role of the Blue Humanities here is to say that this is a confusing ecosystem that isn't directly connected to the support of human communities. And yet it has been a pretty significant and beautiful part of the cultural legacy of many places, including Tenochtitlan, Salt Lake City, and we can look at many other saline lakes across the world as well. And that in support of this, perhaps changing the narrative a little bit and using the Blue Humanities to say, how can we recognize and celebrate this cultural legacy as a means to try to think about how we can start to change the way we relate to these saline lakes and the Great Salt Lake in particular, in addition to analysis and consideration of what the environmental impacts of this could eventually be. So I just wanted to end with a couple quotes here. So this is the top quote here is from the Cantares Mexicanos, and this is translated from Nahuatl, but it's creating circles of emerald. The city stretches out, radiating brilliance like the quetzal feather. Here, Mexico extends outward. And then also a quote about the Great Salt Lake from Terry Tempest Williams, who argues that for my generation, Saltair had become a sinister piece of abandoned architecture. This was not the case for my grandparents. They described boarding the open air train from Salt Lake City to Saltair, how everyone would sing songs in the early evening as the train delivered them to the pavilion perched on wooden trestles above the Great Salt Lake. The dance pavilion catered to some of the great bands of the day: Harry James, Wayne King, Bob Crosby, and Guy Lombardo. And I think this cultural legacy has a place in trying to think about the environmental future of the Great Salt Lake as well. In the interest of this, Fiona and I are actually considering a walk, we're in the early planning stages, I should say, of a walk around the perimeter of the Great Salt Lake this summer to create some art in celebration of that. And thank you, everyone. I know I'm at time.
Thank you very much to our three wonderful presenters. This is super interesting. You don't need to hear from me more than to say, certainly you link these together with the theme of loss and the theme of, in some ways, our human history, certainly this culture has been very recent here, it's caused great damage. Other people have figured out how to live with these lakes, on the edge of these lakes, sometimes in the middle of these lakes. We're struggling. But now we have a few minutes before lunch, and we'll turn it over, 10 minutes to lunch. We'll turn it over to your questions, please.
Question I have in respect to the Great Salt Lake and we're losing the lake is there's a lot of concern about toxic pollutants coming from the dusts. The Great Salt Lake once upon a time was part of the Lake Bonneville, and of course Lake Bonneville we know now as the Salt Flats. Are we dealing with the same sort of issues that they dealt with back when Lake Bonneville evaporated?
Hello, is this, okay, you can hear me. Lake Bonneville dried up 13,000 years ago. And so there are salt flats from there. I wouldn't necessarily say, or I wouldn't choose Lake Bonneville to look at when looking at saline lakes drying up and their impact on human health. I would direct us to look at Owens Lake in California, which was similar to the Great Salt Lake in being a saline lake. And we do see that the residents who are downwind of what used to be Owens Lake experience a higher exposure to air pollution and a higher impact or a higher, they have higher rates of bronchitis, lung cancer, all of these respiratory diseases. So I would say Owens Lake is probably the best example of what is maybe going to happen here.
I would also say that Lake Bonneville actually didn't evaporate. It emptied out over the Snake River due to an earthquake emptying the natural dam. It was up in Red Rock Pass up by Preston, Idaho, and it went down the Snake River and out to Columbia. So the Salt Lake is what's left of Lake Bonneville after it drained.
I guess the only other thing I would add too is that a lot of those toxins are protected by a crust that covers most of that lake bed. And that, you know, will keep the dust down for some period of time, but human activities are also starting to erode that crust, and that's also increasing the impact of those toxins coming out as well.
More questions, please.
So one thing I've been thinking a lot about in relation to the Great Salt Lake and Owens Lake is that's a terminal lake that was water removed from a much lower population base to a much larger population base, and we are the opposite of that. And I'm wondering, and it was super interesting to hear about the lake in Mexico City because obviously that's a very large population base. And I've been wondering if there are examples, or if the Great Salt Lake is unique as a place where water, in a sense, is being diverted for a population base, but we live next to the place that's being impacted. Does that make sense? So the people in Owens Lake who live next to Owens Lake is a much smaller population, much smaller political power, I would imagine, than when compared to Los Angeles, right? We are impacting ourselves. We're not impacting another community, right?
Yeah, I actually think that Lake Teshkoko is kind of a good example of that. It was happening for slightly different reasons though. So our issue with the Great Salt Lake is not that we're actually like draining the lake directly, but impacting the inflows to the lake. But with a kind of similar result, with Lake Teshkoko being, yes, like right beside Mexico City and Teotihuacan. And it was, in kind of this example, like this kind of history of the Spanish coming in, there was this, developed water infrastructure that was a kind of a great example of how to live alongside such a kind of complicated ecosystem. And I mean, we don't know what would have happened, right, had the Spanish never colonized Tenochtitlan. The Mexica were there for 200 years, and we don't know what that future would have looked like without colonization. But what we do know is that that infrastructure was kind of deliberately destroyed and then neglected. And that was like what then led to all of these issues in that region. And so I think it is a good example of that as well. It's like, yes, it was like impacting the community that was kind of causing these problems simultaneously. And then of course, it's much more difficult to go back and then say, how do we restore these things? How do we find a new way to be with this ecosystem that we've changed and probably won't ever get back in quite the same way?
Yeah, I do think it's interesting to look at power structures, especially when we're facing a potential health hazard. I would also like to point out that most of our water isn't being used by the residents. of Salt Lake City that's being diverted from these tributary rivers, it's going to agriculture. And so there's definitely another power structure playing into that. So it's not specifically that the residents are taking all of this water and using it for drinking, but it's also the agriculture, and that's the big source. So reevaluating where we are putting our water will be very important to save the Great Salt Lake.
Who's next?
Really interesting. I'm really curious though, about this idea of human history and natural history that somehow in Great Salt Lake has been like separated. And I say this to a lot of people because outside of Utah, I get a lot of questions about the Great Salt Lake, and I try to tell people, I'm like, the city's kind of oriented away from, look away from the lake. And so now we're in this crisis where we need people to look at the lake and be aware of it. But part of what's so interesting about the stories you're telling is that that wasn't always the case. So can anyone speak to the things that started happening, that started orienting people away from the lake in the business?
So in the case of Saltair anyway, it was extremely popular at the beginning and people wanted to go to the Salt Lake. We didn't have any of the reservoirs that we have nowadays. It was the only place to cool off. They didn't have air conditioning. As Saltair went on and the attractions it offered, a lot of those like movie theaters and bowling alleys started getting built in Salt Lake City. And so you didn't have to go to Saltair for those things. So people started abandoning the lake because they didn't go to Saltair anymore for those things. And people started not taking mass transit because to get out to Saltair, originally you took the train. People started moving to their cars, and Saltair did eventually build a road out there, but by the time I think the ship had already sailed, people were just abandoning it. And a lot of ways people called it back then is they would say, we didn't want to go all the way out to Saltair. They felt like it was a million miles away when they could go bowling or watch a movie a block from their house. And so I think that was one thing that we started getting reservoirs and other things that we didn't need the lake anymore, is how they saw it anyway.
Good question. We have a minute or two. Please.
Would you associate like?
Could you speak up, please, for the room?
Okay.
Speak. Thank you.
Would you associate the quality of the Salt Lake with Saltair? Because I mean, the attraction of Saltair is the Salt Lake. So as Saltair is decreasing, would you say that the attention to the Salt Lake also decreases with it?
I would say so, yeah.
Also to add to that, I work at Antelope Island State Park. Nothing I say here supports what I do there. Just disclaimer, I don't want to get in trouble. But it is really interesting. I work at the Visitors Center, and I'll have people come in and they'll say, you know, I've lived here for 20 years and I've never been to Antelope Island. But yet we have hundreds of international visitors coming into the state park every day. So it's really interesting to see this dichotomy of where the locals aren't necessarily going to Antelope Island surrounded by the Great Salt Lake and embracing this beautiful ecosystem. Yet we have international visitors coming every single day to look at this beautiful landscape. And I think that's just something really interesting I've learned.
I think we have time for one more quick one.
Ms. Summers, very interesting paper. One of your slides showed a number of plumes. I think plume was the word used, or spots of pollution. Did you have access, or perhaps they don't exist, stations around the valley which measure levels of air pollution that could figure into your conclusions?
Yes, that's a really great question. And I'm really sorry that I did not put this information at the beginning of the presentation, which I like to do. I love to support the people that I work with. That data came from Kevin Perry, who is a scientist at the University of Utah in the atmospheric sciences. And I was able to use his data that he's collected over the past few years and put it onto these GIS maps so that it can become more of a visual tool. Coming from biology, I love numbers, and I think I can look at statistics all day, but I know not everybody enjoys that. So I think visual aids such as maps and other GIS tools can be really helpful in visualizing these catastrophes. Thank you.
Awesome. We are exactly at 11:31.